You know, I've spent over 9 decades watching how governments change the rules on people, and I've learned something important. The changes that affect your daily freedom matter more than the ones that make headlines. Right now, in 2026, there's a quiet shift happening at DMVs across America that every driver over 70 needs to understand, because ignorance here could cost you your independence. Here's what most people don't realize. 23 states have already implemented or are rolling out new assessment protocols specifically for older drivers. These aren't the same renewal processes you've been doing for years. We're talking about cognitive screening tests, reaction time measurements, and mandatory in-person evaluations that didn't exist in your last renewal cycle. California, Florida, Texas, the big population centers, they've all modified their approach, and the differences between states are startling. Now, I'm not one for alarmist nonsense, but I am one for facing facts squarely. The data shows that vision requirements have tightened in 17 states, and some have introduced medical clearance forms that your doctor must sign before renewal. The real question isn't whether these changes are fair, it's whether you're prepared to navigate them successfully and keep your driving privileges intact. Let me walk you through exactly what's happening state by state, so you can stay ahead of these new requirements. Let me start by telling you something that might surprise you. The government doesn't actually want to take your license away. That's not how bureaucracies work. What they want is to avoid liability, and there's a massive difference between those two objectives. When you understand that distinction, you start to see why these new driving rules for people over 70 are structured the way they are. The insurance companies have been pushing data at state legislatures for years now, showing that accident rates change with age, and the legislators respond not with wisdom, but with procedures. They create processes that let them say they did something without actually solving the underlying problems. It's the same pattern I've watched play out in boardrooms for 70 years, just applied to public policy. Now let's talk about what's actually changed in 2026, because the details matter enormously here. In Illinois, for example, they've moved to a system where drivers over 75 must renew in person every 2 years instead of every 4. That doesn't sound dramatic until you realize what in person now means. You're not just walking in, taking an eye test, and walking out anymore. They've added what they call a functional assessment, which includes questions about your medications, your medical history, and whether you've had any recent incidents that might affect your driving. The DMV clerk is now trained to flag certain responses that trigger additional requirements. If you mention that you're taking 3 or more prescription medications, that can automatically route you to a mandatory medical review. Nobody explained this to people when the law changed, and thousands of seniors showed up for routine renewals only to discover they couldn't complete the process that day. California has taken a different approach, and it's worth examining because California often becomes the model other states follow. They've implemented something called the Safe Senior Driver Program, which sounds benign until you read the fine print. Every driver over 70 now receives a risk score based on their driving record, their accident history, and remarkably, their medical claims data that insurance companies share with the state. If your risk score exceeds a certain threshold, you're required to complete a supplemental driving test that's more rigorous than the standard road test. This isn't the 15-minute drive around the block you might remember from your teenage years. They take you on highways through complex intersections, and they're specifically watching for things like delayed reaction times, difficulty with lane changes, and problems with spatial awareness. The pass rate for these supplemental tests is running at about 68%, which means nearly 1 in 3 people who take it lose their driving privileges on the spot. Florida has gone in yet another direction, and this one particularly troubles me because of how it creates a 2-tier system based on geography. In Florida, counties with populations over 500,000 have implemented mandatory cognitive screening for all drivers over 72. But in rural counties, these screenings are optional unless triggered by a specific incident. What this means practically is that if you live in Miami-Dade or Orange County, you're taking a cognitive test that includes memory exercises, pattern recognition, and situational judgment questions. If you live in a small rural county, you might never face that requirement. The test itself isn't particularly difficult if your cognitive function is normal. But here's what concerns me. There's no standardized scoring system across counties, and there's no clear appeals process if you fail. I've looked at the legislation, and the language is vague enough that individual DMV offices have tremendous discretion in how they apply these standards. Texas has introduced something that I actually think shows more wisdom than most states, though it's still problematic in execution. They've created a graduated renewal system where the requirements intensify based on age brackets. If you're between 70 and 74, you renew every 4 years with a standard vision test. Between 75 and 79, it drops to every 3 years and adds a basic reaction time test. Over 80, you're renewing every 2 years with comprehensive testing. The logic here is sound. Risk does increase with age, and more frequent check-ins make sense. But the reaction time test they've implemented is causing problems because it's administered on a computer touchscreen, and many seniors who have perfectly adequate driving reflexes struggle with the technology itself. They're failing not because their reactions are slow, but because they're not comfortable with touchscreens. That's a design flaw that penalizes people for technological unfamiliarity rather than actual driving ability. Now let's discuss vision requirements, because this is where I've seen the most dramatic changes across state lines. 23 states have tightened their visual acuity standards specifically for older drivers. New York now requires 20/40 vision in both eyes for drivers over 70, whereas they previously allowed 20/40 in one eye, with the other eye being worse. Pennsylvania has added a peripheral vision test that many people fail, not because their side vision is impaired, but because they don't understand how to take the test properly. You're supposed to keep your eyes focused on a central point while indicating when you see lights in your periphery. But if you move your eyes, which is instinctive, you fail automatically. I know a man who had perfect vision, failed this test 3 times, and finally passed only after his eye doctor coached him on the exact technique. That's not measuring vision, that's measuring test-taking ability. The medical clearance requirements are perhaps the most invasive change, and they vary so wildly by state that it creates real hardship for people who live near state borders or who split time between multiple states. In Arizona, drivers over 75 must now submit a medical clearance form signed by their physician every time they renew. The form asks the doctor to certify that the patient doesn't have any condition that would impair their driving ability. Sounds reasonable, right? Except doctors are now in the position of making judgments about driving when that's not their area of expertise. A cardiologist might be hesitant to sign off because the patient has had a heart condition, even if it's well controlled and poses no practical risk. The doctor faces liability if they certify someone who later has an accident. So many physicians are simply refusing to sign these forms or are adding so many qualifications and restrictions that the DMV denies the renewal anyway. This has created a backdoor system where your driving privileges depend not on your actual ability, but on whether your doctor is willing to take on legal risk. Michigan has introduced mandatory reporting requirements that I find particularly troublesome from a civil liberties perspective. Healthcare providers in Michigan are now required by law to report any patient over 70 who they believe may have a condition affecting driving ability. The provider doesn't need proof, doesn't need a formal diagnosis, just a reasonable belief. Once reported, your license is automatically suspended pending a DMV review, and you bear the burden of proving you're fit to drive. Think about the implications here. You go to your doctor for a routine checkup. You mention you've been a bit more tired lately, or you had one incident where you got briefly confused about directions, and suddenly you're reported to the state. Your license is suspended before you even know you've been reported, and now you're scrambling to schedule appointments and gather documentation to get it reinstated. The presumption has shifted from innocent until proven guilty to restricted until proven capable. Let me talk about the renewal frequency changes, because this affects your planning more than you might realize. 19 states have reduced the renewal period for senior drivers in 2026. When you had an 8-year renewal cycle, you could plan around it. You knew well in advance when you'd need to deal with the DMV. Now, with 2 or 3 year cycles becoming common for those over 70, you're dealing with this bureaucracy far more frequently. Each renewal means taking time off, gathering documents, potentially taking tests, and facing the uncertainty of whether this will be the renewal where new requirements trip you up. The administrative burden alone is significant, but there's also a psychological weight. Every renewal becomes a referendum on your independence, a reminder that the state is watching your age and making judgments about your capabilities based primarily on a number rather than your actual performance. The cognitive screening tests that are being rolled out deserve special attention because they're probably the most controversial element of these changes. 8 states now require some form of cognitive testing for drivers over a certain age, and the tests vary dramatically in rigor and relevance. Some states use simple screening tools that take 5 minutes, things like drawing a clock face, remembering 3 words after a short delay, basic arithmetic. Other states have implemented more elaborate assessments that can take 30 to 45 minutes and include complex problem-solving tasks. Here's my concern with all of them. They're testing generalized cognitive function, not driving specific cognition. A person might struggle to remember a random list of words but have perfect situational awareness on the road. Conversely, someone might pass these paper and pencil tests easily but have real problems with the rapid decision-making that driving requires. We're using convenient proxies rather than measuring what actually matters. The practical driving tests have also been substantially modified in many states, and this is where I see both the most promise and the most problems. When administered properly, a driving test is actually a reasonable way to assess capability regardless of age. You're being evaluated on what you can actually do, not on assumptions about what people your age typically can do. Several states have developed new driving assessment protocols specifically designed to test the skills that tend to decline with age, checking blind spots, judging gaps in traffic, responding to unexpected situations. Oregon has done particularly thoughtful work here, creating scenarios that mimic real-world challenging situations without being unfair or discriminatory, but the implementation is inconsistent. Some DMV examiners are well-trained and fair-minded. Others bring their own biases to the process. I've heard accounts of examiners who seem to be looking for reasons to fail older drivers, who penalize minor errors that they'd overlook in younger drivers, who create an atmosphere of such stress during the test that it's hard for anyone to perform well. One aspect that doesn't get enough attention is how these changes interact with the renewal fee structures. Several states have actually increased renewal fees for older drivers while simultaneously shortening the renewal periods. In Washington state, for example, seniors now pay the same renewal fee every 2 years that they used to pay every 5 years. The state isn't being transparent about this. They don't announce that senior drivers are paying proportionally more. They just reset the renewal period and kept the fee the same per renewal. Do the math, and you'll see what's happening. This feels like a penalty for age, a way of extracting more revenue from a population that typically lives on fixed incomes. When you combine increased fees with increased frequency with increased testing requirements, you've created a system that's substantially more burdensome than what existed just a few years ago. The notification processes for these new requirements have been inadequate in most states, and this might be the most frustrating aspect of all. Changes in law should be accompanied by clear public education campaigns so people know what to expect before they show up for renewal. Instead, most states have simply updated their websites and assume people would find the information. Many seniors don't regularly check DMV websites. They show up for their renewal appointment expecting the same process they've been through multiple times before, only to discover new requirements they're not prepared for. They don't have the necessary medical documentation. They haven't studied for a knowledge test they didn't know they'd need to take. They're not mentally prepared for a cognitive screening. This creates unnecessary stress and often means people have to make multiple trips to the DMV to complete what used to be a single visit process. Now, I want to address the elephant in the room, which is whether any of this is actually making roads safer. That's supposedly the justification for all these changes, improving road safety by ensuring older drivers are capable. But when you look at the accident statistics carefully, they don't support the premise that age-based restrictions are an efficient safety measure. Yes, drivers over 80 have higher accident rates per mile driven than middle-aged drivers, but they also drive far fewer miles in lower risk conditions at lower speeds. When you look at total accidents and fatalities, older drivers are not the primary problem on American roads. Distracted driving by people of all ages, impaired driving, and aggressive driving cause far more harm. If states were truly focused on safety rather than political optics, they'd be implementing stricter enforcement on cell phone use while driving or requiring periodic retesting for all drivers regardless of age. Instead, they're targeting seniors because it's politically easier than cracking down on behaviors that affect all age groups. The impact on independence and quality of life cannot be overstated. For many people over 70, driving isn't just about convenience. It's about maintaining connection to their community, accessing health care, shopping for groceries, visiting family and friends. In rural areas and suburbs without public transportation, losing your license can mean losing your independence entirely. You become dependent on others for every errand, every appointment, every social engagement. The psychological toll is real. Studies have shown that seniors who lose driving privileges experience higher rates of depression, faster cognitive decline, and increased mortality. When we implement driving restrictions, we need to be honest about these trade-offs. We're not just making a safety decision, we're making a decision about quality of life, about dignity, about independence in your final decades. So where does this leave you if you're over 70 and facing these new requirements? The first thing is to know your specific state's rules because, as I've explained, they vary tremendously. Don't rely on what worked last time you renewed or what your friend in another state experienced. Look up your state's current requirements specifically. Second, prepare in advance. If medical documentation is required, get it scheduled well before your renewal deadline. If there's a knowledge test, study the manual. If there's a driving test, consider taking a few lessons with a driving instructor who can identify any weak areas and help you sharpen your skills. Third, understand your rights. In most states, if you're denied a renewal or have restrictions placed on your license, you have appeal rights. The DMV should provide information about this process, but you may need to ask specifically. Don't just accept an adverse decision without understanding whether you can challenge it. Finally, and this is important, be honest with yourself about your capabilities. These new rules may be imperfect and sometimes unfair, but the underlying question, whether you can drive safely, is legitimate. If you're having close calls, if family members are expressing concern, if you're avoiding certain driving situations because they make you uncomfortable, those are signs worth taking seriously. Driving is a privilege, not a right, and it comes with responsibility to yourself and others on the road. Sometimes the wisest decision is to voluntarily reduce your driving or to stop before the state forces the issue. That's a hard conversation to have with yourself, but it's better than the alternative of causing harm. The goal here isn't to fight every restriction out of principle, but to ensure that decisions about your driving are based on your actual abilities rather than assumptions about your age. These 2026 changes have made that more complicated, but not impossible if you approach them strategically and with full information about what you're facing.